Passive voice primer is all about how to know what passive voice is, when to use it, how to avoid it to put power into your prose. What you're going to learn in this quick little video is what is passive voice in the first place, why it's bad or why you would prefer to use active voice, how to recognize it, when is passive voice appropriate, because believe it or not, sometimes it is, and then how to stop being passive and start taking that action. First, a little bit about me. My name is Teresa Goodrich. I'm obsessed with writing, have been ever since I was a little girl, and I stopped reading books with pictures in them, or could read books without pictures in them, I should say. Always known I wanted to write, always known I wanted to be an author. Finally made the author part happen when I was 47. In the meantime, I'd gotten a degree in journalism. I founded the local Tourist in 2002, so it's almost old enough to drink. And then I created Your Chicago Guide in 2020. I am also the author of several books, including the Two-Lane Gems travel memoir series, complete road trip guide for grown-ups. It's everything you need to know to plan and remember your next road trip. Living Landmarks of Chicago, a true passion project where I told the stories of 50 significant Chicago landmarks. And then I've also written my first novel, Peril on the Peninsula, featuring travel writer Alex Page. And I'm knee deep into the second one, and that'll be coming out very, very soon. I'm also a writing coach. I teach the writing workshops for the Midwest Travel Network and have done so since 2019. We've taught in places as far apart as Billings, Montana and Gulf Shores, Alabama. And I'm also a speaker. I have spoken multiple places, including the Chicago Auto Show, and I'm also on the on the Travel and Adventure Show circuit. Spoken in Chicago, San Diego, Denver, and in 2023, I will be adding LA to the mix. So enough about me. So what is passive voice in the first place? Passive voice is when the action is performed on the subject. For example, the video on passive voice is watched by you. So you are the object in that sentence. Was watched is the verb, and then the video was watched by you. So the video is being acted upon by you. The plane was flown to Bali by female pilots. That's passive voice because the plane is being flown by the pilots. Do you see how that works? Okay. Active voice is when the subject is performing the action. You watched a video on passive voice, or the female pilots flew the plane to Bali. So hope that's pretty clear, I think. So why is active voice better? Active voice is not as wordy, and we're just going to go through a few examples here. Lions stalk their prey. That's active voice because you've got the lions doing the stalking versus the prey is stalked by lions. So the prey is being stalked by those lions, those scary lions. And it's not much of a word savings. It's only, I think, 1-2 words shorter using active voice versus passive. But those words add up, especially if you're writing a longer piece. Another example, the children built sandcastles versus sandcastles were built by the children. Every night, the restaurant is cleaned by the servers versus the servers clean the restaurant every night. And then millions of tourists visit Chicago every summer versus Chicago is visited by millions of tourists every summer. So you can tell it's also a little more awkward when you're using passive voice. Using active voice is more direct because the subject performing the action is at the end of the sentence when you're using passive voice. Then it takes longer for the reader to understand what's happening. So you can say, Joe packed a suitcase. Really clear. The suitcase was packed. By whom? You don't even know in this case. It's also clear. Joe packed a suitcase versus the suitcase was packed by Joe. Now, you can see in this example that the sentence that is using passive construction is longer. That means the reader, if there are two readers and one is reading the active voice and one is reading the passive voice, the person reading the active voice knows immediately that Joe is packing a suitcase. Now, they don't know if he's the one doing the traveling or not, but they know Joe's packing a suitcase. They are done with that sentence and they know what's happening before the second reader has even finished reading the passive voice sentence, and they don't even know who's done it yet. They've got 2 more words to go before they figure out, oh, it's Joe packing the suitcase. So you can see it's a lot clearer if you're using active voice. It also propels the reader forward. If you've got shorter, more direct sentences, the active voice leads the reader more efficiently from one sentence to the next, from one paragraph to the next. It just keeps the flow going. So, Joe packed a suitcase for his flight to Bali. A female crew flew the plane. It was a long flight, but the next morning he walked on the beach. Versus, the suitcase was packed by Joe for his flight to Bali. The plane was flown by a female crew. It was a long flight, but the next morning the beach was walked by him. So the first sentence just has a bit more activity to it, a bit more. I mean, they're doing the same thing. It's saying the same thing, but the first sentence is a lot more active. And that's because it puts the reader in the story. If everything is passive, then everything's happening to the author. Nothing's actually happening to the reader. When you use active voice, the reader can put themselves into the story itself. So it's harder if you're using passive voice for the readers to envision themselves like craning their neck on an architecture tour or eating an apple pancake or stretching out on a king size bed. Because if you've got, say, the apple pancake, that the apple pancake was eaten by Lisa, then that pancake is the focus. And Lisa, who we meet at the end of the sentence, is eating the pancake, but the reader is not going to feel like they're eating the pancake. And that's kind of what you want to happen. And that's how readers can connect with your writing. Okay. So how do you recognize passive voice? One of my favorite grammar books is Dreyer's English. And he was a copy chief of Random House, kind of knows what he's doing. It's rather, I mean, I read this book start to finish on Kindle in 2 nights. And so I had to get it on my bookshelf. But one of the things that he says, a trick that copy editors use, is to find out if a sentence is passive, to say by zombies. So you could say the suitcase was packed by zombies. The apple pancake was eaten by zombies. Or if you prefer something else, Halloween is Monday, so zombies are appropriate. You could also do mummies. The road was driven by mummies, driven on by mummies, or by clowns, or by puppies. It just, when you're reading a sentence, if you're not sure if it's passive, if you can add by zombies or by puppies or by Joe, by anything, then that means that sentence is passive. So when is passive voice appropriate? It's can be appropriate when you want a slower pace. If you do want to slow things down, as we went through that earlier example, it does tend to slow things down. You're using more words. They're not as active. The reader can sit back and relax a little bit. So if you want to slow things down a little, then you can use a passive voice for that. It's also used if you don't know who's doing the action. And I'm going to see, I've got an example over here. Let's say you're writing about a highway and you don't know who constructed the highway. You could just say the highway was constructed in 2017 or something like that. But you'll know that's passive because it would be the highway was constructed by construction workers. I don't know, but by zombies. So you can add the by zombies, so that way you know that is a passive construction. There's an example. I see the cave paintings of Lascaux were made in the Upper Old Stone Age. We don't know who made them. And sometimes if you're writing about the history of a place, and you may not know specifically who did something, that's when you'll want to use passive voice. Another time you want to use passive voice is if the person or thing doing the acting is irrelevant. A lot of times that can happen, let's say, during an inauguration. You could say something like, President Biden was inaugurated or was given the oath, and then you don't know who it was given by. So you could just say President Biden was given the oath of office. That's not a great example, but I think you get the idea. The people reading your story are not really concerned about who gave him the oath to read back. They want to know what actually happened. So that's a time that you can use passive voice and be okay with it. Let's see. Okay. Now, how do you stop being passive and start taking some action? Well, the biggest thing to is knowing, recognizing when you're using passive voice. I mean, I recently went through and I was editing my first book, and I was knowing what I know now, like, oh my goodness, it was riddled with passive voice. It was riddled by me, by zombies with passive voice. I didn't know as much. And now I'm able to go back through and tighten up that prose because I recognize it. And if you start paying attention when you're speaking and when you're reading and when you're writing to that sentence construction, and if you see it, then you know you can change it. So that this is one of those cases where knowing is more than half the battle. It's like all the battle. Um, Yoast SEO plugin for WordPress, I know that does monitor passive voice. I I use rank math instead of Yoast, but I know a lot of people do use Yoast. Both Grammarly and Pro Writing Aid have free versions that you can use. I use Pro Writing Aid. I do have the pro version, but that's the one I prefer. And they will both also check your writing for passive. So until you get used to it, seeing it and catching it on your own, you can use those tools. And sometimes they do what's called false positives. That's not really passive construction. So that's why it's important to know. Uh, as part of watching this webinar, you will be getting a workbook with a lot more examples and exercises. And feel free to email me with questions if you've got them. And here's to being clear and having more active prose. Thank you very much.